Welcome to Domain 2 as we study and prepare to sit for the Healthcare Information Security and Privacy Practitioner exam, briefly known as HCISPP, although that's not quite very brief. All right, this domain is all about the regulatory environment, the rules, the laws that tell us how to behave. The legal issues with regard to security and privacy, and remember that is our focus for this particular exam, can range from our local and state regulations to federal as well as international laws. Remember that in our growth and our expansion with technology, interoperability is so incredibly important. And the one of the purposes for this is so we can share information with other countries. Well, that means that you have to be aware of the laws of the land in the other countries regarding what you're doing, not only the country in which you live. So, this deserves some good attention from you. There is a chapter in the textbook about this, and focus on those which are mentioned on the screen. Now, data breach regulations, we do everything we can. That's what the security aspect is, of course. We do everything that we can to prevent this, but you should know already that it cannot be 100% absolutely protected. Accidents happen because we have human beings involved. That's the way it is, okay? And of course, there's also the malicious loss of data, which can come from someone trying to get back at the company or a particular patient or group, to hackers and those who send out malware and ransomware, which is really kind of sad because they usually only do it to prove that they can do it. But we still have to be responsible for the harm. We also have to be aware of what our obligation is about reporting when there is a loss of data. And this may not only be limited to protected health information, but also financial information as well. So, as we look at the OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, there are very specific guidelines that exist with regard to the collection, the storage, the protection, and the release of personal data. And while our focus is usually healthcare personal data, we also must be aware that as a part of our responsibilities in the business of healthcare, we are also collecting and housing certain aspects of someone's financial data. And that must be protected as well. We must do everything possible to make certain that the data that we collect is relevant, accurate, complete, and current. Because without it fitting all of those criteria, it may not be worth anything. But remember that your obligation to protect personal data is absolute. And we have responsibilities with regard to how to keep this information secure. There are regulations and rules and guidelines that must be obeyed, and when broken, reported and fixed. Okay, so one of the things that we must do as we look at our compliance with keeping data safe and secure and protected is the way that information flows. This is very important because Those transition periods, those transition points are when the data is most vulnerable to being stolen or to being tampered with. So you want to make sure that you investigate the various models, such as the state machine model. I actually remember a question on my test about the state machine model. Okay, multi-level lattice models, non-interference models, matrix-based models, information flow models. All 5 of these models, you have here just simple one-line explanations of what they are. Make sure you understand and can recognize the differences. Jurisdiction implications. If you've ever watched a police television show or movie, you always hear about them talking about jurisdiction. This is not your jurisdiction. This is my jurisdiction. Well, okay, healthcare jurisdiction can also be complex because we have so many different levels to comply with. The jurisdiction, therefore, for oversight and compliance will also be multi-layered. Of course, we have federal, and remember that federal usurps state, but only when federal is more restrictive than state. And state usurps county when state is more restrictive. So basically, know the layers and understand that the most restrictive rule in this chain of jurisdiction will be the most compelling and the one that we must comply with, the strictest. So if the federal law says you may do something and the state law says you must do something, must is much more restrictive and specific. That means that you must comply with the level of state requirements, which will comply with federal above and beyond. And that's a good thing. Data subjects. All right, whenever there's research, and remember, collection of data, analysis of data, and the evaluation of that analysis to use is research. Okay, so the subjects are the purposes, the people from whom, the reasons why we are collecting the data. Okay, why do we need to know a patient's blood pressure or allergies or how long they have been in the hospital? Whatever it might be, there's a purpose to collecting that data and analyzing that data. And you should be familiar with the fact that, yes, it is your business. You are not just a technician that is here to do what you are told: collect this data, store this data, analyze this data, produce results of this data. And then you stand there and say, well, I don't know what they're going to do with that. You have to know. It is part of your responsibility. Absolutely. And so all 5 of these points on your screen, or 6, all must be within your knowledge bank, and you must make certain that you are meeting all of these requirements. All right, now this also was something that I saw not only in practice tests, but also on the test itself, which were questions about who does what, who is responsible for what. And yes, we are talking about the regulatory environment. This is more than just job descriptions or being task oriented. This has to do with who is responsible for complying with which aspect of the rules and regulations and the laws. So it is important that you understand. And just to point out, and I'm sure you could figure this out, but hey, you got to give me something to teach you, right? The 4th bullet, processors, that is not talking about a computer processor. That is talking about a human processor. Those who hold or process data, okay? Especially data owners, controllers, custodians, processors. These are the four delineated categories of those who are involved with data. Treaties. I know that sounds like such an old-fashioned word, doesn't it? But what you want to know is this safe harbor component of almost every single contract. And that is the safe harbor portion of a contract or a treaty is a good faith that the individual and the organization did everything possible to do and fulfill their responsibilities under a law or a regulation. It's as simple as that, okay? Now, of course, it sounds like pretty vague, and who could, oh, I tried my best, okay? Of course, there has to be evidence of this. But the fact is that you need to understand when there is a question or someone is speaking to you about safe harbor, you need to know what that is. It's actually the documentation, the collection of evidence that you did everything possible, that you had all the updates, all the patches, you changed passwords every 30 days, you made sure you did solid authentication and identification, everything possible, and still the system got hacked. That is what safe harbor means. Okay, regulations within our country, these United States. Essentially, you want to be looking at those regulations having to do with CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is an agency of the federal government with whom we in healthcare deal with the most. And they are the agency that is most responsible for overseeing our laws and making sure that we are compliant. And the Office of the Inspector General works along with CMS. They are the police department of CMS and the federal government, if you will. Okay. The American Medical Association is a representative and interested party from the private sector. And then you have the Joint Commission, which is accreditation. Now, you should have learned about the Joint Commission that it is voluntary accreditation for hospitals, also other facilities such as nursing homes, long-term care facilities, hospice. And I always laugh whenever I talk about the fact that Joint Commission accreditation is voluntary, because that's what it states. It is voluntary. However, there are federal rules and regulations, as well as regulations in the private sector, that say if you're not accredited by the Joint Commission, we will not do business with you. We will not let you open a hospital, provide services. Or you can provide services, but you cannot bill CMS. So we're not going to pay you. No reimbursement. Okay. So I laugh at the word voluntary because it's voluntary, but not if you really want to be in business. Then there are industry specific laws to healthcare. These are laws that are not general, but very specific to what we do. For example, mental health issues, substance abuse, any documentation, data collected about pregnancy or HIV status. All four of these are considered super confidential. And that means that there are extra protocols with regard to keeping this data safe. You must know that. You should be familiar with these two legislative laws, HIPAA as well as high-tech. High-tech brings you ARA and the most ever popular meaningful use. Policies and guidelines must be in place to encourage, no mandate your staff to comply with the laws. They need to clearly define the process for initiating, creating, reviewing, recommending, approving, and distributing policies. There must be guidance, and to just say, well, you have a bachelor's degree, so you certainly should know about HIPAA in that. It's not enough. The organization itself, the facility itself, must take a stand and say, it's not only federal law, it's not only state law, it is our law. And this is accurate throughout all of these layers of regulations. And you remember earlier, on an earlier slide, we talked about federal, state, and county, and the layering and the overlap of jurisdictions. The fact is that violating a law then also becomes a multi-layered violation. But in order for the organization to protect itself, as part of safe harbor, if you will, you must show and evidence that internal policies specifically mandate compliance with this particular law. And it cannot just say, you have to know HIPAA's privacy rule and comply with it. That is not effective. You must outline in your facility policy exactly what they need to know, exactly what they need to do, and exactly what they need not to do as it applies to your staff. And while I said that, which sounds like this is going to be a policy that's going to be 17 pages long, you need to also keep it short and sweet, short and simple, and make sure that you are speaking to your staff in ways that they can understand. If you get highfalutin, if the policy makes it too complicated for them to understand, much less comply, they are going to do what they kind of sort of think that you want them to do. And they may not know everything that you know, and therefore that is totally insufficient. And that will come back on you. References, and please don't forget, consequences for noncompliance must be included with every policy. When they're constructing a law in Congress and they're about to enact it, there's an old saying that asks, does the law have teeth? And this is all the same thread of philosophy that parents have with children, that teachers have with students. Are there consequences for failing to comply with the rules? Now, the rules could be something as simple as, don't put your gum in your pocket without putting in a piece of paper first, or don't pull your sister's hair. Okay, if any of you have a sister, you probably heard that a couple of times from your parents. But my point is that if nothing ever happens to a child who disobeys, then this child will never learn to obey. There must be consequences. And in school, we have consequences. Is if you don't take a test, you get a 0. That impacts your final grade, which can impact your ability to graduate and get your degree, which certainly can impact your ability to get a good job or get a raise or a promotion. Okay, it is all threaded together. And you must understand that so is this. You must make certain that you are supporting standards that already exist, as well as to create and verbalize. And when I say verbalize, it doesn't necessarily have to mean verbally. You must communicate these standards, your expectations for your staff, what they need to do, what they need to not do. You must communicate this clearly and straightforwardly to your staff. That is your obligation as the manager. And you want to make sure that these standards not only seek to comply with governmental regulations, both our country and internationally when appropriate, but you want to make sure that they don't interfere with productivity and they work to enhance the efficiency of your department. You have to tell them how to accomplish what they need to while complying with your policy. Now, some of you may be thinking, why are you talking about internal policies when the name of this domain is regulation management? And that's because internal policies are the regulations, the laws of your organization. And this is the line in the sand that your staff members must not cross. Because as they cross it and it goes up that ladder into a federal non-compliance issue, then not only will the staff member suffer, but you and the entire organization will suffer as well. So you must provide them with step-by-step instructions as to how to complete a task while meeting the standards and meeting the requirements of the policy. Do not assume. And what the hardest thing sometimes when doing this is to remember back when you didn't know either. You know, there are some things that when you've been doing them for a long time, you take them for granted that everybody knows them. And I'm sure at some point you've had this occasion or opportunity to, like, what? You don't know how to do this? Okay, but remember, when individuals are born, they know how to breathe, they know how to poop and pee, and they know how to cry. They have to be taught how to eat. They have to be taught how to drink. They have to be taught how to walk. And that means that everything else also has to be taught. And it is our jobs to make sure that if you are going to assume anything, assume that they do not know and you need to teach them. Now, there are existing compliance frameworks which are listed here on your screen. Understand what these organizations are and what they oversee. What are they in control of? Now, as we are talking about regulations and complying with regulations, ideally, of course, this is an absolute, okay? However, in real life, it is not absolute. What we have, though, are ways to ensure that we are doing everything that is possible. So, in this scope, we must make sure that we do a risk assessment and then pay careful attention to the results of the assessment. Because when vulnerabilities are identified, that is your opportunity to do something about it. You have to know about it first and then fix it as best you can before anyone else finds out or gets hurt. Risk remediation, and I know this is a little backwards. Risk remediation means you're going to fix the vulnerability. You're going to get rid of the risk, okay? There's a door that is a risk. We're going to put a double deadbolt on the door. That is remediation. You have now gotten rid of the risk of somebody unauthorized coming through that door. Risk mitigation means you can't get rid of it totally, but you are going to reduce the opportunities for the vulnerability to be taken advantage of. Risk transfer means you make it somebody else's problem. And I laugh because sometimes it's possible, but very often it is not. And sometimes you may transfer the responsibility for completing a task or for keeping something secure. that does not transfer the ultimate responsibility for making sure that aspect is kept secure. And risk avoidance means get rid of those little things that are not absolutely necessary that offer risk. Oh, that's smart. If you know that there's a pothole on this road, risk avoidance, drive around the pothole or take a different road. That's smarter than any other thing that you could do to make sure that no one is harmed by that pothole. Get it? Does that make sense? Okay, control variance documentation. Of course, everything must be documented. This is absolute. This is absolutely absolute. Okay? So any variance in controls, any leeway, this must be documented and mitigated or remediated whenever possible to get rid of a variance. It's much easier to control things when everything is solidly black and white. It's that gray in the middle that can get sketchy. Residual risk tolerance. This refers to compensating controls that can be temporary, such as a generator can, on a short term, compensate for lack of electricity in the building. You can keep everything going. You can keep your servers going. You can keep those firewalls in check until you can get the electricity back on. Compensating controls can support the transition to a new application or a project. And it's very important that we always look for alternatives to do everything possible that during times of change, transition to a new application, transition to an upgrade of a new system, whatever it might be, you have to keep your eye on the locks on the door. And that's, of course, inside the system and inside the computer, not only on the physical door to the computer room. Organizational code of ethics. There is a code of ethics that is specifically guided to computer security. Technology is a vast and glorious thing. I think we all probably understand that, or we wouldn't be here. However, it is important that you identify that you're not just the IT person who works with or for a healthcare organization. You are being given the privilege to be privy to data that is very, very personal, that is very, very protected. This is not the same as doing analytics for how many hits Target had on their website yesterday. This is incredibly important data, and you have access to it in some way, shape, or form. And therefore, you have to have an additional code of ethics that goes on top of your standard information. And these must also be specifically spelled out when you are the manager to make sure that those in this department are clear with regard to how they are supposed to behave and what is expected of them. Also included in this must be training on ethics. Yes, again, people are not necessarily born with ethics. I know some people think they may be innate, kind of like logic. But the fact is that you can teach logic, you can teach ethics, because sometimes people behave unethically because nobody taught them what was right. This is your responsibility. There is no, didn't your parents teach you? No, okay? It doesn't matter. Remember what I said before. If you're going to assume they do not know. Nobody before you has taught them. Therefore, you must teach them. And remember that HCISPP examination is sponsored by ISC2, and they have their own set of ethics that you must be familiar with. And HCISPP has its own professional code of ethics. And here on your screen is a list of the things that you must be aware of, you must be knowledgeable of. You must be able to understand what they are, how they work, how they fit into your picture. Okay, if you have any questions, chances are good, so do other people. So post in the HCISPP Domain 2 discussion forum for this week, and let's talk it through. Let me clarify for you, provide more explanation, more detail, whatever you need. We're going to work together to get you to pass.